Hi, welcome back. What I've got here is just a quick review rundown on specific species interactions in a community. And a community is made up of the living things that are interacting with each other in a given area. So you might be studying a particular forested area. And if you were just studying the interactions of the living things, the trees with the squirrels and the chipmunks with other chipmunks and the deer with the grass. That would be studying community interactions. And there's a few species interactions that go on in a community that you need to know. Just a quick rundown of those. So here's an opener. When different species in an ecosystem have activities in common, they're going to interact. It's kind of like, duh, right? So if squirrels want acorns from a tree and chipmunks want to do something in that same tree, well, they're going to interact with each other. They have needs in common. They live in the same area. They want to use the same resources maybe, or their resources are in the same area. They're going to interact. And sometimes those interactions are neutral. Sometimes they're beneficial. Sometimes they may be harmful. And these are examples of some basic species interactions, again, that you'll need to know. So we've got competition, predation, and symbiosis. Those are the three that will come up on the AP test, the three specific types of species interactions. I'll do a real quick look at predation, quick look at symbiosis, and then spend a little more time on competition. So predation, most of you are familiar with this one, right? You've got a predator that's hunting the prey, which is the hunted. You've seen lots of those predator-prey videos that I know most students like. So you're familiar with this relationship, right? Predators do have adaptations. So there's adaptations that help predators capture their prey. So predators have adaptations that make them good hunters. Maybe they're well camouflaged so they can stalk their prey. Maybe they're fast so they can catch their prey. They have claws and fangs that allow them to pull down and take down their prey, and maybe poison, some kind of poison that helps them take down their prey. But on the other hand, prey have a way to defend themselves, or they would go extinct, right? So they have adaptations that allow them to escape the predator. Maybe again, they're faster than the predator. Maybe they have a poison that deters the predator. Maybe a camouflage so they can hide, or they have spines that make them unappetizing to the predator. So the prey also has to have ways to avoid predation, or again, they would go extinct. So it's got a good chance to throw in an adaptation, right? Something that allows an organism to survive as well as mate and pass on their genes to the next generation. But other than that, the only thing maybe on the AP test, maybe they would have a graph or something about a predator-prey and populations, how they impact each other. But usually there's not a ton about predator-prey relationships, so not a whole lot else to say. Symbiosis. These are species and they're living in a very close union. They live like either in or on each other. It's a very close union or close relationship. And there are a few examples or types, I guess. So one type of symbiosis is called parasitism, or a parasite, right? A parasite feeds maybe on another organism. One organism benefits, the other is harmed. So for example, a flea sucks the blood from your dog. The flea is a parasite. The flea benefits. It gets nourishment from the blood that it takes from your dog. But your dog is harmed, right? It's itchy, it's scratchy, it doesn't feel good. That's an example of a parasite or parasitism. It's a very close relationship, One benefits, one is harmed. The parasite benefits. Its host or its prey is harmed. And it's a type of symbiosis because symbiosis means living in a close relationship or a close union. Another type of symbiosis is mutualism. Think mutual, both. They both benefit. Both individuals in the relationship benefit. So there's a caterpillar that protects ants, these particular ants in the tropical rainforest. You're like, why would the caterpillar do that? Well, the caterpillar gets nectar from the ants. The ants actually produce this sugary food or nectar that the caterpillars eat. So they get nourishment, and the ants get protection from predators. The caterpillar will actually fight off wasps and other predators of the ant. So it's a win-win. They both get something good. And they live very close together. The caterpillar is on the leaf right next to the ants. And they live very tightly together. The last one I've got here is called commensalism. It's a type of symbiosis where one species benefits and the other is just kind of neutral. It's just kind of there. So there was an example in a video. There was a robin, a bird, and it would follow this tortoise on the Galapagos Islands. And the tortoise was just doing its thing. It was just walking, doing its thing. But as it walked, it kicked up dirt. When it kicked up dirt, that kicked up insects that were in the soil, and the bird could follow behind and snatch up those insects. So the bird, the robin, benefited, and the tortoise was just neutral. It wasn't really helped or harmed. It was just doing its thing. That's an example of commensalism. And again, it's a close relationship. The bird was like, the robin was right behind the tortoise, following it constantly. And that's it. So predator-prey symbiosis, there's usually not tons of questions on the AP exam about those, but if you have a general idea of what they are, you're good. Now, competition. Competition is a bit more of an important idea on the AP exam. So I've got a few more slides here about that topic. So competition, right? You think fighting. So when two or more organisms, species, they're fighting for food, space, resources are limited. Maybe there's, I always think of that rat video we watched, right? When the bamboo trees were not fruiting, there was competition for food. There wasn't enough fruit to go around. There wasn't enough food to go around. But species could fight for space. Maybe there's not enough space to build a nest, or there's not enough materials to build a home. So species that are using the similar resources or the same resources in the same space at the same time, if those resources are limited, they're going to fight for them. That's competition, right? And it may occur between individuals of the same species. So in my yards, there's squirrels, and they're always fighting over acorns. They're always fighting for space in the trees. They're the same species, and they fight with each other. But competition could also occur between members of different species. So maybe in a forest, chipmunks are competing with squirrels for space in the trees. It'd be different species. If you remember, we spent a lot of time on niche, and this idea of competition and niche have a relationship, I guess. Let's check this out. So if you remember, niche is basically a species' role in its ecosystem. So what it does, what it eats, what resources it needs, what conditions it requires. So I had an example here. A chameleon is an organism. It's a carnivore. It's kind of a scavenger. It will eat eggs from birds. It will eat insects. It helps to break down waste matter because it will eat even things that are dead or dying. So it helps to return nutrients back to the environment. It lives, this particular one I saw in a video, it lived in kind of a tropical area on an island on the ground level of a forest. That's its niche. Kind of what it does. It's a part of the ecosystem where it fits. When we talk about niche, we also talk about this range of tolerance. So the fish in this example, part of their niche is they need water of a certain temperature. So the optimum is when the temperature for these fish is best. The temperature is within their, we call range of tolerance, but it's actually even like at this point where it's like, it's just perfect. They are healthy, they are reproducing, they're well adapted to survive best at this temperature. Now, sometimes it might get a little cooler, it might get a little warmer, but they can still survive, they can still tolerate it, they can still do okay. Maybe they're not reproducing as much, but they're still hanging in there, they're still doing all right. It's within their range of tolerance. Then there are points at which it's too cold for them to survive, they can't survive. It's too hot for them to survive, they're not going to make it. So those are out of their range of tolerance, or their zone of intolerance. So a part of a species' niche is the conditions under which it survives. And there are conditions under which it survives better than others. Right? When things are the best, we call it optimum. If it's, within their range, like maybe it's not perfect, but they can still handle it, got that range of tolerance, and there's points at which they can't survive. That's also a part of their niche, conditions under which they survive. So we looked at an assignment that kind of brought this all together. There were some graphs, and they're on the next slide, and the graphs were about paramecium. And paramecium are little single-celled critters. Usually you'll find them in pond water. They're just single-celled organisms, and there are different species. There's Aurelia, there's Caudatum, and Bursaria. They're all paramecium. They're just, different species of paramecium. They all live in pond water. They may have slightly different niches, but they all do live in pond water. So I've given you these graphs, and the graphs at the top, A, here, so A, these three graphs at the top, basically they took paramecium Aurelia, put it in a test tube. They also put yeast and bacteria in the test tube that the Aurelia would use as a food source. They had a separate test tube, and they put paramecium Caudatum in it. Same setup, same temperature, same kind of pond water with yeast and bacteria. That would be a food source. And then lastly, they did the same for Bursaria, separate test tube. So there were 3 test tubes with different paramecium in them. Otherwise, everything was the same temperature, bacteria, and yeast as a food source. And if you look, they all kind of did the same thing, maybe different levels, but they all kind of increased pretty rapidly and then sort of leveled off. Increased sort of rapidly, leveled off, and so on. Didn't increase quite as much, but increased and leveled off. We assumed that they were eating food, they were reproducing, their population was growing, and then maybe at some point they used up all the food sources and kind of leveled off. So they're sort of at this carrying capacity. All right. Then the scientists set up another experiment. They took paramecium Aurelia and paramecium Caudatum and put them in the same test tube. They added yeast and bacteria as a food source. And then they had a second test tube with paramecium Caudatum and paramecium Bursaria. Put them in a test tube together, added bacteria and yeast as a food source. So let's look at this one up close first. Look at this one up close. So if you look, the Aurelia and Caudatum both kind of went up, but then Caudatum declined and Aurelium kind of continued up and then leveled off. Now they do not feed on each other. It was not a predator-prey. This was an example of competition where they both were occupying the same niche. They wanted the same thing at the same time, the same place. They both wanted to eat the bacteria and the yeast. They both wanted the space in the test tube. Right? But one was the better competitor, the Aurelia. The Caudatum was not a great competitor. It didn't compete well against the Aurelia, and we see that because its population declined. So this is called the competitive exclusion principle, that if 2 species want to occupy the same niche, they want the same food, they want the same resources in the same place at the same time, they're going to compete. And what scientists have discovered, generally one is usually the better competitor and outcompetes the other. So if this was in nature, Caudatum may have gone extinct, or some other things may have occurred, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But this is an example of competitive exclusion principle. One species ends up being the better competitor than the other. So here you go. If 2 species have the same niche, they want the same thing at the same time, they're going to compete, and one ends up being the better competitor. We had done an activity with cutthroat and rainbow trout, if you remember, where someone had introduced rainbow trout. So the cutthroat trout had lived in this area here. Somebody introduced the rainbow trout to this area, and the cutthroat couldn't compete. So the cutthroat ended up isolated here, where it was a little bit colder, and the rainbow trout couldn't survive as well. They were sort of pushed to this smaller area. They could not compete with the rainbow trout. This is the idea of competitive exclusion. They're in the same place, the same time. They want the same resources. Their niches are overlapping. One usually is a better competitor, in this case with the rainbow trout, and it pushed out the cutthroat to a more isolated area. If you remember that activity, it is in your notebook. Okay, so the cutthroat were pushed out, they end up isolated. So here's an example. The cutthroat trout could survive in a little bit colder water. The rainbow liked it a little bit warmer, but there was this area of temperature in the river where they could both exist. The rainbow trout was the better competitor, and it pushed the cutthroat trout to the colder, more isolated areas of the river. And the rainbow continued to occupy kind of warmer area. There was this area here where they would compete and push out the west coast. It's hard to say, cutthroat trout. West slope cutthroat trout. Dang, it's a mouthful. And again, it's called the competitive exclusion principle. It is in your notebook. We talked about this. Something you could refer to. So the next setup the scientists did, they took the Paramecium caudatum and the Paramecium bursaria, put them in the same test tube, again with the yeast and the bacteria food source. And if you look, they still increased and kind of leveled off, increased and leveled off. Not quite as much as when they were grown alone, but neither of them really shot down, like this. Neither of them shot down where you'd say like, oh, they died off. They both existed together. So what does this mean? Well, this means they had a niche overlap. They maybe competed a little bit, but then they diversified maybe somewhat. Maybe some students thought maybe one of them ate yeast and the other ate the bacteria. They were able to like coexist because their niches were slightly different. They weren't exactly the same. So maybe the caudatum lived at the top of the test tube water. Maybe the bursaria lived at the bottom. Maybe, like I said, one ate yeast, one ate bacteria. So while their niches overlapped, there was a slight difference in the resources they needed or could use, and that allowed them to coexist. So their niches weren't completely overlapped. This sometimes is called resource partitioning or maybe a specialization. We see this happening. Their niches overlap, right? They want the same things at the same time in the same place. Well, like the trout, they end up limited to the colder areas. They get pushed to one area. Or maybe some individuals have adaptations that allow them to become specialized or fill like a slightly different niche. So with the Paramecium caudatum and bursaria, maybe one could live at the top, some could live at the top of the water, like the caudatum could live at the top of the water, and the bursaria could live at the bottom. So they were slightly specialized, slightly different. Maybe the caudatum could eat the yeast and be really good at that, and the bursaria could eat the bacteria in the test tube, and they were really good at that. They become specialized, and that would allow them to avoid the other alternative, extinction. One becomes extinct. So we see that in birds. They can avoid competition. Maybe they all eat the same insect from the same kind of tree, but they can eat at a different part of the tree. Maybe some eat at the top, some eat at the middle, some eat on the inside. They avoid competition with each other by partitioning the resource, becoming specialized at eating at a certain point or part. And then we see this with the evolution of bird beaks. They become very specialized at eating at a different spot. So they all want to eat on the coast, on the shore, but their beaks and feet allow them, or legs allow them to, like, the flamingo can get deeper in the water. Maybe this one's got a longer beak to get down a little deeper. So they can become specialized to avoid competition. The whole goal is avoid competition so you can survive to pass on your genes. So adaptations allow species to become specialized and do that and avoid that competition. Lastly, a couple terms, generalist and specialist. So the birds that we just saw were specialists. They had very particular beaks and legs and feet that allowed them to get a particular organism. They had very specific conditions under which they lived. A generalist would be like a cockroach. Maybe it's not great at any one thing, but it's kind of good at everything. It can get food from a lot of different places. It can live in a wide range of conditions. So I thought this would help. Specialists have very narrow requirements. They have adaptations that make them very good at a particular thing. Generalists are kind of good at everything, maybe not great at any one thing. They can tolerate change because if one thing goes away, they can sort of like, get their food or from another source. That kind of would be good. So just some key terms you got to know. I throw that in.